Can I ask a favor? Can I take this off? I hope you don't mind. It's all right, right? Okay. You leave yours on. I can do without it. Thank you, President Chodosh, Board of Trustees, the faculty, the women's softball team, which is fighting the good fight somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, the staff of CMC, and the proud and somewhat impoverished parents, and above all, congratulations to you, class of 2016. Give yourselves a mighty round of applause. I'd also like to thank my old college friend, Bob Fagan, who's a star of your English department, who I should tell you sings the praises of CMC from coast to coast. And thank you as well to those very confused souls on the Speaker Selection Committee, who after discovering that Steph Curry was busy with the playoffs, Jon Stewart is retired, Beyonce is squeezing some lemons, and the entire cast of Hamilton is otherwise engaged. After discovering this, you settled on a magazine editor who on Wednesday afternoons sits down and in all seriousness picks the best talking dog cartoons in the nation. That is my consequential responsibility. Nice going. I want to thank you for at least pretending that I was your first choice. That was awfully nice of you. Flattery, as you will discover in the realm of romantic love and job interviews, will not get you everywhere, but it can hurt. Now, honestly, you can't imagine what a privilege this is. Even though my own graduation is 35 years in the foggy past, I can at least guess what a glorious day this is for you. It's an honor to be a part of it, a true honor. You're taking home a degree today from one of the very, very best colleges in the country. And that is, to quote a current statesman, a huge achievement. And this is a huge and happy day above all for your parents and relatives. Trust me on this, trust me. My sons are now college graduates, and I don't know that I've ever been more profoundly and idiotically happy than sitting in the parents section at commencement, grinning like an idiot for hours and hours and hours. It was almost after a while you felt like you had a facial sprain. And the parents also get a bonus. Not only does the tuition stop right now, they also don't have to wear a funny hat. And they don't have to wear a black robe because within about an hour you're going to feel like you could grow mushrooms inside of that thing. So let's hear it for the parents, the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, the siblings, the friends, all of them here today. Now down to a few serious matters. These matters are in no particular order: dissent, speech, and politics. When I mentioned to one of my colleagues at the magazine that I wanted to come to your campus and say something about this, he looked at me quite curiously and he said, "Wouldn't you rather stick your arm in a wood chipper?" After all, these issues have become the source of a great deal of energy and anxiety and focus on campus. As I mentioned, I graduated college in the early Mesozoic era. The Brontosaurus was the school mascot. Our favorite album was Beethoven, live at the Palladium. Beethoven actually came to play at the Princeton gym, and he was awesome. He was a little bit like the Drake of his generation. A little moody after a breakup, but ultimately cool. In other words, it was 1981, and at that time, with the Vietnam War finally over, the galvanizing political issue on campus was the most vivid form of institutionalized racism on the globe at that time: apartheid in South Africa. And like many undergraduates in the United States, including a young guy at Occidental College down the road who went by the name then of Barry Obama, many of my classmates and I were quite certain that the way to press the regime in Johannesburg toward making political concessions needed to end apartheid would be to convince major stock shareholders to divest their holdings in any corporation doing business in South Africa. Along with hundreds of others, I marched in picket lines and chanted slogans and made, of course, non-negotiable demands of university administrators to divest. At one point, we even organized ourselves and we took over Nassau Hall, Princeton's main administrative building. We slept overnight on Nassau Hall's cobblestone hallways, and for a generation nurtured on the Sealy Posturepedic, this was a physical sacrifice equal to Gandhi's 24-day march to the sea against British imperialism in India. The college administrators, of course, handled the anti-apartheid sleepover with a deft, liberal-minded aplomb. They had learned much from their more confrontational predecessors. They treated us with the same courtesy as the staff of the Beverly Hills Hotel, the way they treat their premier customers. Although we were surely trespassing and in violation of any number of laws, there was never any threat of arrest. Various deans came to listen to our demands, and they were very sympathetic. And I'm to this day surprised that they didn't put chocolates under our pillows. In the end, of course, the university did not divest one penny of its investments. Nevertheless, I don't think you can say that our demonstration had no effect. 14 years later, apartheid in South Africa came crashing to the floor. Nelson Mandela, you're welcome. I'm kidding, of course, it was 13 years. Seriously, it's very easy to recall the limits and humor of our efforts. We marched only in the spring sunshine. That in the Northeast, that's all you get, is a little spring sunshine. We risked nothing more than academic probation, which was probably written in invisible ink. And what really brought down apartheid, of course, in all seriousness, was a prolonged political struggle centered around Mandela and the African National Congress. Theirs was an effort of unimaginable bravery, a long-term effort of both uprising and civil disobedience, of true suffering, extraordinary endurance. There are countless martyrs to that cause of South African freedom and racial equality. So I'm sure, tucked away in the wealthy suburban Princeton, New Jersey, with our very modest knowledge of the South African political dynamics and our sure-minded slogans, we were at times a little absurd. Our language was sometimes outlandish. And yet, for all of that, I do think that the experience left a mark. It added, I'm sure, only the tiniest way to the sum total of foreign pressure. There's no kidding about that. But it left, I think, a distinctly useful residue on those who took part, and to some on the greater university community at that time, including those who argued, as many rational conservatives did at the time, that divestment was wrong-headed, counterproductive, a strategy that led to disengagement from the issue. It was an extremely healthy debate. And also, by protesting the stark question of apartheid thousands and thousands of miles away, that experience brought us, left and right, black, brown, and white. It brought us much closer to thinking more seriously as young people about the questions much closer to home and those that persist today. These past few years have seen much dissent and debate and even tumult on campuses, particularly on questions of race and criminal justice. From Claremont, McKenna, to Yale, to Missouri, to Howard. As always, nearly everyone is engaged somehow as observers, as people discussing the issue, but a small minority tends to do the protesting. And often it's the case that minority students, low-income students, and first-generation students do much of the protesting. Not all, but a lot. And that deserves deep respect. Dissent, the mere fact of it, The mere fact of it deserves respect. I have nothing but admiration for students who go about finding their political voices. It is not easy, not on any side. Dissent is a large part of the foundation of this country and the movement toward the horizon of a more perfect union, an equalitarian horizon that is never quite reached, but constantly sought. This is a country largely built on dissent and sustained by it. From the founding fathers who, for all their myriad faults, began their civic lives not as statesmen, but as anti-colonial rebels, to the abolitionists and the suffragists, the dissidents who have worked for civil rights, for women's rights, gay, lesbian, and trans rights, to Hispanic rights marchers, the ACT UP activists and marriage equality campaigners, and on to the Black Lives Matter movement today. It is a large and varied and complicated tradition. These protests were never confined to the attention of the protesters. Sooner or later, everyone awakes to the world around them and comes to focus on these arguments that are raised. They think about them, they argue about them, and are even changed by them. Dissent is the invaluable spark to civic progress. And while you may argue with its central arguments, its tactics, its language in the moment, it is essential to mark its innate value. Now, race is this country's deepest and longest standing wound, a fundamental part of its history. Much of this country, it can never be forgotten, was built by human beings owned by other human beings. The White House and the Capitol, citadels of our democratic rule, were built by chattel slavery, by men and women of West African heritage, by slaves. And down the street, not far from where they worked, were auctioneers selling freshly arrived Africans still in chains. That is part of our legacy. The house where the Obama family sleeps was built by slaves. This is part of our contradictory story and our ongoing story. But as that same president makes sure to say in every speech he gives about race, the American story is also one of vivid and undeniable progress, of advance spurred by dissent, and no less important, by politics. I think the president, who is of my generation, is absolutely right to say that the America we live in today, the day of your graduation, is markedly better than the America when I graduated, when he graduated. The Cold War, with its atmosphere of nuclear confrontation and subjugated nations and peoples in Europe, is over. My city, your city, and many other American cities are much safer than they were before. Statistics on teenage pregnancy and the national health are all markedly better. Last week even brought the news that the difference in mortality rates between African American and white Americans has narrowed. But human progress, even in the wealthiest liberal society, is only that, progress. There's no such thing as resolution, a state of beatific being in which all questions and crises, social, political, geopolitical, legal, environmental, are somehow resolved and brought to an end. In fact, we human beings are capable of moving backward, of grave error, of self-inflicted catastrophe. For example, today, for many reasons, including a misbegotten crime bill in the 90s intended to deal with horrific crime rates brought on by the crack epidemic, we are, by far, the country that leads the world in incarceration. No one, not the Chinese, not the North Koreans, not even the Russians, is close. Here is a shameful statistic, a shameful state of affairs. As of 2013, we are 4.4% of the world's population, and we have 22% of its total prisoners. The rate is dipping a little, but not nearly enough. It's important to note that politicians were not the first to point this out in the public dialogue. Instead, it's been engaged scholars like Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, who mapped out the anatomy of this state of affairs. It's been dissenting movements like Black Lives Matter that have made sure, have insisted that this issue is part of the national discussion and even the presidential debate this year. That kind of pressure is invaluable. Why? Because it leads to politics. Without it, there is no politics, no progress, and only complacency. Sometimes a skilled politician takes note of that. When a group of civil rights leaders in the 40s visited Franklin Roosevelt at the White House and made certain demands, FDR said, in the spirit of hope, not rejection, make me. You have to make me. Make me do it. Form a social movement that will change enough minds so that the politics becomes possible. We see this today. Many people have watched members of Black Lives Matter interrupt political rallies this primary season or even loudly argue with candidates, and some people find this rude and offensive. And sometimes that may even be the case, but you have to ask yourself this: to what degree was the reality of mass incarceration and police abuse of people of color a matter of such general consciousness among the voters and the political class before Black Lives Matter? Politeness in politics is not necessarily the highest virtue. At the same time, and this is no less important, dissent fails, it dissolves, if it ends there. When dissent remains aloof or disdainful of politics, if it values purity over struggle in the arenas of legislatures and the courts, it fails. Frederick Douglass is a great American, not least because of the influence he had on Abraham Lincoln. And the same can be said of Dr. King on LBJ or on gay and lesbian activists on President Obama. Protest and protesters are admittedly not always right in method or in argument. Sometimes they do or say dubious things. Fair enough. That was always the case. It was the case in the 60s, it was the case in the 80s, and it's the case now. But this has always allowed entrenched powers to dismiss them in a stroke, and way too readily. Recently at the University of Michigan commencement, the graduation speaker mocked university administrations for bowing to pressure on issues like safe spaces, code words, and trigger warnings, and so on. Now, I get what that speaker was talking about. No social protest is immune from excesses of rhetoric or behavior, or even sometimes of being outlandish. And in doing so, they infuriate or bewilder their opponents and their elders. I have to say, as an editor and a writer, free speech is at the center of everything I believe in. At the same time, I thought the breezy critique of the speaker at the University of Michigan was too easy. After all, that speaker was Michael Bloomberg, a guy in his 70s who, thanks to being in possession of a personal fortune of around $35 billion, was able to win election as mayor of New York 3 times. I can admire Michael Bloomberg for his commitment to environmental causes and gun control. That's my view. But I think his critique in Michigan, particularly when he worries aloud that billionaires are being roughed up too much, well, that seemed underthought, and maybe a moment without self-reflection. A far more serious phenomenon is the way the Republican nominee for president is using the battering ram of political correctness as the pretense for his campaign and the excuse for saying every ugly thing that seems to enter his mind. The big problem, he tells us, with this country is political correctness. Really, that is our biggest problem. I didn't come here today to talk about the campaign as such, but to ignore politics is impossible. Under the guise of liberating speech, Mr. Trump has weaponized speech. He has aimed much of his fire at women, people of color, Muslims, at any human target that he thinks will arouse the resentment of his political base. He has, in the style of so many demagogues before him, pronounced himself absolutely free of restraint, the restraints of decency or speech, in order to appeal to some of the worst instincts of his potential base. A billionaire with a dodgy business background now poses as a champion of the working class. You have to acknowledge his skill and his uncanny modernity. His language is not in the old style of, say, George Wallace on the State House steps of Alabama. Rather, his appeal is thrown out as almost comic, as a proposal. What I'm trying to suggest above all is not that you necessarily go out and campaign one way or the other. That's entirely your business. What I'm trying to suggest on a day like this is that with graduation, the stakes have changed. The stakes have changed. Campus life is important, but in a way it's a kind of rehearsal, a preparation, just as your classes in physics or literature were a rehearsal and a prelude to a life of the mind. The stakes become more serious, unavoidable, and no matter what kind of life you choose, you cannot live entirely outside of public life. Your life begins anew today in so many ways. You face so many questions about what you will do, how and where you will live. Your parents are begging you to live very close to home. Few, if any of you, will be bona fide full-time political activists. We know that. But in addition to questions of how you will live your private life, it's important to ask yourself how you will live your life as part of a community, even the national community, a community that dearly needs people of your immense intelligence, your skills, your passions, your energy. Generations before you have made life better, easier, longer, healthier, more connected, more interesting in many ways. That's your inheritance, our inheritance. Lucky folks like me and you have possibilities in our lives unimagined by our grandparents. But we have also failed you in all the ways you know, leaving you all the problems we know too well. So, dear graduates, you have observed your elders for a long time, and you have depended on your elders for a long time. And we elders, a very mixed record. Every generation being comprised of human beings has at best a mixed record. For one thing, we've given the planet a tremendous thrashing that needs reversing. So how will you contribute? What role will you play as a citizen, as a doctor, as an engineer, as a mother, a father, a lawyer, a business person, an entrepreneur? What will you do? Begin by voting, please. That's a minimum, even if millions fail to rouse themselves even that much. But what else? What else? Sooner or later, when the memory of the party tonight fades, and I swear to God, if you do the party right, the memory will mercifully fade. I think I remember that. But the question is, what will you do? The world is now in front of you. And the world, in some way you can hardly imagine, in small ways and in large, depends on you. How will you contribute? So it begins. I have immense confidence and joy being here with you today. We celebrate your commencement, and we're depending on you. Thank you.
Please stay around. In case you do. Yes, we might never hear. We're going to get an honorary degree now.
I am.
Yes, sir.
You going to vote it? Can I get a job?
No, thank you for those inspiring remarks, Mr. Remnick. It is now my pleasure to confer upon Mr. Remnick an honorary degree pursuant to the resolution adopted by the Board of Trustees. I would like to invite two people who already have come here to come here. They are Professor Robert Fagan, the Barton Evans and H. Andrea Neves Professor of Literature and Director of the Gold Center, and CMC Trustee Jim McElwee. Thank you. Let me check if this is yours. Got it. Yes. Dear Mr. Remnick, in recognition of your many contributions and achievements as a leader in advocacy for literature and free expression, Claremont McKenna College hereby confers upon you the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws, with all the rights and privileges appertaining thereto, in token of which we cause you to be vested with the hood of the college appropriate to your degree, and present you with this citation and accompanying diploma.
All right.
Please do be seated. Thank you very much.